to give it up for my DJ, my sister, my love, my friend, Miss Eve B. Golden. I am so tremendously happy to be here with all of you. Before we get started, I am going to take some time to make some thank yous. And maybe we should cut the motherfuckers while I'm trying to be grateful. Appreciate you, babe. So as you know, we are here activating the space of the Encoding Futures show. It is curated by Mashinka Ferenc Hakopian, and I want to give a major shout out. Every time I say somebody's name, just make noise like you really fuck with them. Because I fuck with them. She is a badass lady, really, really smart, to say the least. A special thank you to Paul Wang, who has designed this evening's lovely site. Thank you to the OXY ARTS team here, led by Mandy Yesayan. Thank you for making everybody's life easy with you and for your business. And Maricela Ramirez, y'all are so deeply awesome. And thank you all for being here. We sold this show out in just a couple of hours. That made me feel real cunt. And I'm really, truly bowled over by your support. Because you know when you come, well, I think most of you know, unless somebody dragged you here and you're like, what am I getting into? But most of you know that when you come to a Mandy event, there's like a light little ass whipping involved. And I appreciate that you are here. I appreciate that you are open to hearing some strongly worded opinions, praxis suggestions, challenges to your beliefs and behaviors. And those of you who are here with me tonight have shown that you are really brave and mature and comfortable with yourselves because you are open to doing that sort of thing. So give yourselves a round of applause. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is kind of like the final concert night of the Encoding Futures show. For those of you who did not see it, anyways, I'm gonna read what the show is about, and these are Mashinka's words. Artificial intelligence structures the socio-technical terrain of our present, and the human agents who train it shape political imaginaries of what is yet to come. From predictive policing to judicial risk assessment to border surveillance to automated hiring, the encoded biases of AI systems magnify existing structural inequalities. Predictive models don't forecast a world that might be, they reproduce the world depicted in their training data. They project, worlds marked by algorithmic oppression. That's Sophia Noble. That's a name. The new Jim Code, that's Ruha Benjamin. Algorithmic violence, that's Mimi Onuoha. And algorithmic coloniality, this is several people, so hold your applause. Shakir Mohammed, Marie Therese Ping, William Isaac, make some noise for those. Algorithmic world making often unfolds in a black box, an opaque space of automated decision making, whose rationale is hidden from public view. Researchers and cultural workers are opening up the black box for scrutiny to imagine possibilities for feminist, anti-racist, and decolonial AI. This exhibition assembles the work of artists who visualize the limits of our current algorithmic imaginaries and envision speculative futures engineered for just outcomes. But tonight, we're gonna take it easy. We're gonna talk about something a little less political. Something fun and fancy and free. A space that we often look to for refuge from the seriousness of politics or the omnipresence and potent effects and affectations of social media. Tonight, I'd like to talk to you about music. Okay, we have some music lovers in the audience, huh? Yeah? Yeah, make some noise if you like music. Yeah. I think that's most of you. Make some noise if you don't like music. Checks out. Now a tougher question. How many of you are anti-black? Nobody made noise, that's the right answer, yes. But, we live in an anti-black world. It's hard to escape, so maybe tonight, kind of going into that pain spot of where might I be a little anti-black? Now, here's the toughest question. How many of you consume music in ways that are anti-black? Y'all lie. Now, bunch of lies in here. All right. Now, people love to say about music, well, it's a great song, it can't be racist. They like to act as though the sonic world is free from bias. It's a utopian ideal where people are judged not based on the color of their skin, by the content of their bops. Not how much money they have or their proximity to whiteness, but a place where a hit is a hit, and no matter what you look like or where you're from, if you've got the talent and the skills to make people dance, to make a banger, there's nothing that can stop you. Wow. Tonight we are going to deconstruct this unwieldy and uncomfortable question I've asked. In this here black box, we will do the cultural work to imagine a possible feminist, anti-racist, and decolonial music listenership. In order to do that, we will take a look at how technology and artificial intelligence are connected to the way that we listen to music. And we will go all the way back to the original gram. And we'll end with the current gram. We'll look at 3 particular moments throughout history wherein the extractive nature of music making, listening, and distributing accelerated and intensified, as well as the specific technological changes that enabled and embedded these accelerants. And lastly, we will inspect how they sit within a social and political landscape that drives those moments of cultural extraction. Ultimately, we'll look at a pattern that is common with the general contours of racial capitalism, investigate how music, although often romanticized to be above and beyond racism, sexism, bodyism, and the like, is actually a space where this is more pronounced than other creative industries. And lastly, we'll inspect how today's technology represents the most intensified modality of this pattern than ever before. That's just an introduction. All right, y'all, are you ready? Are you ready to get into this? Okay. We have one commercial break, and then I will join you at the desk. You know what? I'm not even gonna fuck with that. It was working before you came here, but Apple likes to embarrass me. As soon as I start talking about technology, all these glitches start happening. Are they listening? Basically, what they were going to say was, long time ago, Thomas Edison in 1877 created the gramophone. It was very large, it was very expensive. And that's pretty much it. Okay, so, in 1877, Thomas Edison invented the phonograph. This, as you were supposed to have seen, was the first machine that could record and reproduce sound. And as you can imagine, this was pretty expensive technology to own and operate. And of course, it was pretty expensive to buy records and become a collector. You had to have a lot of space in your house. So you can imagine people who had been enslaved only 12, 15, 20 years before that may have had little to no disposable income to buy this sort of equipment, much less the space to accommodate this bulky and unwieldy and cumbersome tool. This digital divide quickly became a musical divide, and this is the first of many major moments, the first of 3 major moments of cultural extraction of Black music. Now, this is not to say that there's not an active Black music scene, right? There is a bustling and expanding Black music scene. You had a spiritual tradition, you had a secular tradition, and that secular tradition was separated into 2 verticals. We'll say one that derives from work songs and one that derives from syncopated dance music, and they become generally jazz and blues, or rather blues and jazz, I should say. But let's remember that we're thinking about how technology moves throughout this entire argument, okay? There are very few African American consumers at this time who can buy these records, and there are very few African American people who can control the means to produce these records. Today, we'll focus on the blues tradition, and that is the direct ancestor of most of the popular music that we hear today. Blues became blues and rhythm in the 1940s after the first waves of the Great Migration took these sounds out of the rural South and throughout the northern part of the country. And bands evolved, growing larger, playing faster, more swinging. Eventually, we get into swing, we get into rock and roll, soul, pop, adult contemporary, hip hop, house, trap, EDM. And there's many ways that we could look at the blues and run blues analyses and talk about the blues. But today I want to focus specifically on usage and usurpation. Black music's roots were not apolitical. They were not just jams. Surely you had some game songs, you had songs that were inherited from a European religious tradition, but you also had songs that were really key communicatory tools. And I want to talk about work songs right now. So work songs are the ancestors of blues music, and work songs were created for 2 reasons. One of those reasons was to coordinate work in large groups, right? So think about it. Everybody's singing a song, and we know, okay, we hit the hammer at X time, or we hoist this large piece of what have you at Y time. And then you also have another reason, which is to make grueling work more tolerable. These songs could be uplifting and animating, and they later became templates for many folk and rock performers. That being said, I'm imagining that there were a lot of Black people rolling in their graves when they heard work songs like Black Betty. Y'all know that one, right? One nodding head. It's in like 30 commercials. Whoa, Black Betty! I'm sure lots of people were rolling in their graves when that was popularized by bands, white bands, like Ram Jam in 1977, Spider Bait in 2004, and the Melvins in 2011. Black spirituals began to emphasize deliverance from the cruelty of their status as enslaved peoples. They looked to the afterlife or the promised land, but then there were songs which promised a more immediate relief from these conditions. Songs like Follow the Drinking Gourd, Michael Row the Boat Ashore, Go Down Moses. These songs actually had hidden messages. Here's an example of one of those hidden messages in context. Frederick Douglass wrote in My Bondage and Freedom, A keen observer might have detected in our repeated singing of "O Canaan, sweet Canaan, I am bound for the land of Canaan," something more than a hope of reaching heaven. We meant to reach the north, and the north was our Canaan. I thought I heard them say there were lions in the way. I don't expect to stay much longer here, was a favorite air and had a double meaning. In the lips of some, it meant the expectation of a speedy summons to a world of spirits, but in the lips of our company, it simply meant a speedy pilgrimage toward a free state and deliverance from all the evils and dangers of slavery. In researching some of these songs, I must admit, I was quite taken aback to see many white church choirs performing these songs. And like with a lot of gusto. And that was weird because it's like, you're like up there singing in church, music that was made to survive the cruelty of your ancestors in a system from which you still benefit. That seemed really off to me. But that sort of shit happens all the time. Now, while we're here, I'm making a formal plea that none of you go to social media and say, "Ooh, Mandy said that white people are not allowed to perform any music that is derivative from African American cultures." Because I didn't say that, and I'm not going to say that. There are a few instances where white people have contributed to American music. A genre like rock and roll. That has roots in blues and rhythm. But there are like the greats, the white greats, like Beethoven. Bob Dylan. What I do find of note here, though, is the power structure, of course, right? How whiteness identifies Black cultural trends, hears sonic ones, and is able to capitalize on these trends, and from these trends, and to disproportionate rates. And what I want us to remember throughout this is how an art form that most of us enjoy for its separateness of the political heaviness that we must endure is actually shaped by the exact same political system. That is, what comes to us as relief, distraction, and soothe is often mediated by the very same power structure from which we are seeking relief. Now, people date the official beginning of the blues at around the time that slavery was abolished. That would be around the mid-1860s, 1870s, and this predates recording technology by about 7 years. Of course, at this time, as we mentioned before, a large portion of people, Black people, were coming out of the rural South, and that's exactly what the first iterations of blues were called. They were called the rural blues. But around the turn of the century, Ma Rainey, one of the legends of blues music, started to incorporate this style of music into her popular vaudeville theater act, fusing the predominant ragtime sounds of the theater with the Southern rural musical tradition. These songs had a pretty unfortunate name. Don't say it, okay. But they went on to popularize African American musical traditions, popularization born of humiliation. And actually, that's how a lot of Black music became popularized and entered the mainstream through minstrelsy in the mid-19th century. Black styles at first were performed by white artists in blackface to defame Black people. And this actually worked as a vehicle to popularize Black styles and even Black instruments, like the banjo, which has its roots in West African instruments such as the Gambian akonting. Ma Rainey was not the only mother of modern blues, but she was also dark-skinned, full-bodied, and had a phenotype that people associate with West African people and their descendants. She had a phenotype that reflected the ancestry of what she was performing. When it came time to make the first blues recording, however, despite her popularity in vaudeville circles, she was not the first person tapped to record a blues record. Instead, that was Mandy Harris. In 1916, she began recording for Victor Records, singing a variety of songs, such as "Everybody's Crazy About the Doggone Blues," "But I'm Happy," and also her biggest hit was "A Good Man Is Hard to Find," but honestly, I have a hard time believing that she pulled that off, because look, she's such a gorgeous white lady. This isn't surprising, but it isn't unsurprising. The mid-1910s were actually the beginning of this massive influx of creatives. You had demographically free-born Black people coming into adulthood and creative maturity. You had Black people fighting in World War I and really deconstructing the ideas of democracy and demanding their rights, both within the ranks and on the home front. You had Black education skyrocketing, and you also had a small but increasing Black middle class bubble up, primarily in northern urban centers. Now, in 1920, though, there is this huge shift, and this is when the African-American composer, Fred Hager, convinces OK Records to lay down a track recorded by Mamie Smith, and it was called Crazy Blues. It was a bit of an accident, though. You see, actually, the person who was supposed to record this record was Sophie Tucker. And Sophie Tucker had a reputation of like kind of utilizing her her experience in Yiddish performative traditions to draw a connection between two groups of oppressed people, her and the Black musicians who she was working with. I find this pretty wild, the idea that Black women first entered the recording industry quite by accident. And also, it's of note here that this was mediated by white people and Black men, and rarely did women have the control of the means of production, if any control. Which is to say that it's difficult to imagine a Black femme recording tradition without the specter of the white and male gaze, and how it desired cultural tradition, which above all might be most profitable. Crazy Blues was a smash hit in part because of the tale of romantic betrayal, in part because of the political message of the song. Indeed, it was not just the forlorn romance of the lyrics and the lilting pickups, the sad and blubbering horns, her bold and boisterous voice, but it was also the commiseration, the dissatisfaction that spoke to the residual social pain of the Red Summer of 1919 and the general political climate at this time. You had Black soldiers returning from war, and they were facing disrespect that they had not anticipated after risking their lives for democracy. You had massive migration northwards of previously rural Black families. You had sharecroppers actually beginning to turn a profit because the entire post-war world needed textiles. And white people started to get threatened, and they started lynching. And in response, this caused reasonable outrage and uprising, caused riots, and unfortunately, hundreds of people, mostly Black people, perished. When Mamie Smith sings, "Ain't had nothing but bad news, now I got the crazy blues," maybe she's talking about her lover, but maybe she's talking about the state of the world at large. But maybe it's both. Indeed, it becomes clear as Smith goes on that she has shifted her ire from her lover to the police state. It is both romantic and political, and this complexity cannot be understated. This is a critical thing to understand about this first Black femme recording artist, that her voice told of both love as well as political strife. And indeed, it is a particular person, rather a particular person in a particular body, who understands this collapse, how deservingness of love interacts with politics necessarily, how they are merely different verses in the same song. When we think about blues, Mamie Smith, the inception of Black recorded music, we remember that it has multiple meanings, erotic and political, sexual and murderous. And it is performed by a certain type of woman, not necessarily dainty, not necessarily desirable, not necessarily genteel. The tradition of this vertical of music comes from a long diasporic legacy that represents a reaction, a mode of communication that was explicitly meant to keep white listeners out at times, a healing space, a tradition, a sonic homeland, a salve for working, labor, and devaluation, complex relationship between interpersonal desirability and how that interfaces with the government. It is not free of culture. It is not up for grabs. Rather, the ease of that extraction, the separation of the art form from its racial, ethnic, and cultural tonalities, its political under and overtones, these are all forms and facets of an anti-Black extraction that is all too familiar. Not in any way special or novel or separate from the traditional forms of labor extraction. And in fact, the illusion that music is somehow separate from the racial capitalism of the rest of the nation's history only serves to create a romantic haze around the work, which renders its workers subject to more abuse, extraction, erasure, and anti-Blackness writ large. Who is moaning in comprehension? Brother. Crazy Blues ends up being a massive hit. It sells 1 million copies in under a year, and in fact, you start seeing Black people really begin to buy music at this point too. After the success of Crazy Blues, record executives were feeling confident and they sought to push the sound, and indeed, that broke the door open for more classic blues vocalists. A few years after this recording, Ma Rainey signed to Paramount Record Company, but even this recognition left her shortchanged and underserved. She went on to record at least 92 songs for the label, but the label was small and low budget, and ultimately her recordings lacked the quality of outfits such as OK and Columbia Records. Again, technology. The moment, however, also brought on Black music entrepreneurs, and in 1920, Henry Pace, the former business manager of Du Bois' Moon Illustrated weekly magazine, sought to enter the game. Now, mind you, this man, the son of a blacksmith from rural Georgia, valedictorian of his class at Atlanta University, was very heavily inspired by W.B. Du Bois. While at Atlanta University, he studied under him and learned the concept of the talented tenth. The idea that if society were to invest in the most gifted individuals, their success would lead and inspire the larger Black community. He believed that music could be a vehicle for racial uplift. In 1918, Pace had entered the music publishing industry with W.C. Handy, the father of the blues, an established composer. Throughout the course of this partnership, they had pitched record companies to work with Black vocalists, but the record companies believed that this would degrade the prestige of their labels. Black Swan Records was named after the nickname of M. Ciceretta Jones, a leading Black concert vocalist of the time. Du Bois was instrumental in shaping public support for Black Swan. In February 1921, he published an editorial, Phonograph Records, that condemned the white demand for comic, darky songs, but nothing else, and for restricting the opportunities open to African American performers. He argued, we must now develop business organization to preserve and record our best voices. For such an effort will reveal the best music, not only of our race, but of all races and ages. He ended, we are pleased to learn that such a company is now forming with adequate capital and skilled management of guaranteed African American ideas and culture. Guaranteed African American ideas. And at first, the intention was, obviously, to record high class and respectable music. They released their first record in May of 1921, an inspirational song at dawning, backed with Thank God for a Garden, sung by the concert vocalist and pianist Rebecca Hughes. They went on to record 45 serious songs, including the first recording of Lift Every Voice and Sing. But after the undeniable success of Crazy Blues, it was evident that not only could blues music sell, but African Americans performing it could make successful records. And that was an opportunity that could not be denied. Black Swan auditioned blues vocalists who would represent their entree into the blues recording markets, including Ethel Waters and Bessie Smith. Now, white people, successful black people, they would have considered Ethel Waters to be the most influential blues singer, when in reality, or according to Angela Davis, who I trust, when in reality, Bessie Smith was more talented and also more accurately represented the socio-historical patterns of black people's lives. Ethel Waters was successful with her audition, that is. Although she did not fit the middle-class background of most of the label's roster, she could sing popular blues in a way that favored the classical styles of the label. Waters was tall, and she was thin, and she could produce what they called a sophisticated sound. We know what that means, right? Something pretty shady. So they had this 1922 show. It was called Oh Joy, and it was Ethel Williams and Ethel Waters. I must make a historical note. All of the Blues Mothers, they were all dykes. They were all dykes! Okay, so... So Ethel Waters would go out onto the stage and she would say, "Where's that partner of mine?" Like her musical partner. And she'd, ask the orchestra leader, like, "Where's that partner of mine? Where's that Ethel Waters? What can be keeping her?" Really shady, okay? Shade, yeah, okay. Speaking of shade, Ethel Waters would come out and Ethel Williams would say, "Are you Ethel Waters?" And Ethel Waters would say, "I ain't Bessie Smith."
Boo.
Bessie Smith, on the other hand, had a style which was more grassroots, boisterous. You know what that means. Unlike the lighter, more lyrical singing of most Black Swan singers, when she stopped curtly in the middle of her first test recording and said, "Hold on, let me spit," she thrust herself outside the respectable model of musicianship that Black Swan endorsed, and the company declined to add her to its roster. Black Swan preferred artists who sounded white, that is. They possessed mannered, light, warbling vocal style, which conformed to stereotypes about white singers' thin, controlled, trained voices, in contrast to the muscular, rough-hewn singing style ascribed to African Americans. I have to come up here and act like it's cool to say all this depressing and upsetting shit. I'm sorry. Bessie Smith went on to have great success when she signed to Columbia Records, but it was actually overall a pretty crappy deal, right? So when I say great success, I mean she sold a lot of records, but of course her contract kept her from really profiting from that. And Henry Pace, I want to make a note here. Henry Pace actually, Henry Pace was passing. and he lived in River Forest in a predominantly white neighborhood outside of Chicago. His children went to college and fell in love and married white spouses, and actually his grandchildren didn't even know he was born. The first blues recordings then offer us a peek into what Black femme recording artists would face for a century beyond. These originators of the art form were poorly remunerated and faced anti-Blackness by means of respectability politics and desirability politics, all of which included their color, their body shape, and the Blackness of their vocal stylings. Their expression and distribution was mediated by accidents, male composers, and mostly white record label executives. And even when the label executives were not white, they had a narrow vision of what sort of Black cultural expression could uplift the race. So we're going to fast forward through some decades that I don't think are quite as important. The 1930s, where we're speaking about technology, most households have a radio. This is the first mass media, and this is the golden era of radio, but you also might have considered it the white era of radio. There weren't any Black people on it. Even shows like Amos and Andy, which featured two Black characters, were performed by white people in Black voice. In the 1940s, another technological advancement, the Billboard recording logs, right? So now you have like an official record of how popular people's music is. And the Black music vertical of Billboard was called the Harlem Hit Parade. And I do want to give you some savory tidbits about the early years of the Harlem Hit Parade. Do you know who the first woman to reach the top of the Harlem Hit Parade was? It was Ella Ray Morris, a 17-year-old white girl from Texas. Only one record spent consecutive weeks at the top of the chart. You know what that was? It was White Christmas. And there was one Black woman who reached the top of the charts in the first year of the Harlem Hit Parade. It was Lady Day. You may not recognize that name. That is Billie Holiday's pseudonym. She couldn't use her real name because she was in a shitty recording contract. In the 1940s, you had, in the gospel vertical, and we're not entirely talking about that, but you did have successful artists like Mahalia Jackson, Sister Rosetta Tharpe. The 1950s, you may recognize this gentleman, Elvis, who is popular for remaking Black music. Let's move to the 60s, shall we? Sorry. Let's move to the 60s. Now, by the 60s, many Americans have a television set. Technology. And this gentleman here is Berry Gordy. He is the founder of Motown Records. And after several ventures, including a smaller label and a record store, and having written hit singles himself, Berry Gordy, similar to Pace, less than half a century before him, he also believed that music was a means by which Black people, could demonstrate equality, if not excellence. The only problem with this, of course, is that excellence was extremely narrowly defined, it was racialized, it was gendered, and it was reaching for respectability. As a child, Gordy had experienced his own success in crossing over on his newspaper route. He sold newspapers in white neighborhoods, noticing that his cuteness created a means of connection between him and white consumers. Gordy looked to create an all-Black label, which Motown mostly was, with a few exceptions. But he didn't believe that this music was racial. He said, quote, "It's not really Black music. It's music by Black stars." As for the Black star making, Motown artists were required to take twice weekly etiquette classes taught by Maxine Powell.
And the two believed in training the roster to have class, style, and refinement to be accepted around the world, even in the presence of the King and Queen of England. This respectability had implications that were especially constrictive for the women of the label. Similar to Black Swan, Motown gravitated towards singers with crossover appeal, specifically those with thinner, lighter voices. And the runaway stars of Motown were the Supremes. Arnold Hirsch of the Detroit News said about the Supremes, "They don't scream or wail incoherently. An adult can understand 9 out of 10 words they sing. And most astoundingly, melody can be clearly detected in every song." You know what this means. They scored their first hit single at the end of 1963 and went on to chart with their next releases in 1964. They made their first of, in that same year, they made their first of 14 appearances on the Ed Sullivan Show. And Ed Sullivan loved the Supremes. He called them the girls. They were a hit with both white and black audiences who were deeply impressed by their restrained but elegant choreography, charm, and fashion sense. Where Did Our Love Go was followed by 4 consecutive US #1 hits: Baby Love, Come See About Me, Stop in the Name of Love, and Back in My Arms Again. And the appearance of the Supremes actually is very much in line with civil rights notions of respectability, right? You think back to the footage that you see of people marching or people sitting at lunch counters or being brutalized by the police, and they look sharp. And this was a strategy, right? Because while, maybe you can get away with brutalizing black people who are badly dressed, not as such with black people in suits. The group went on to have success throughout the mid-1960s, but in 1968, tensions in the group and the departure of studio writer-producer team Holland Dozier Haller threatened their success. Ultimately, the political climate had shifted as well. The civil rights movement, which was bound up in that respectability politics we just talked about, began to give way as major legal victories failed to produce changes in black people's lived experiences. And by 1968, the group was criticized for their mostly white fan base and the same crossover appeal that had previously ensured their success. Alternatively, Motown's male acts, such as the Temptations and Marvin Gaye, they were able to kind of transition with the times and address the needs of black audiences. They eventually gained the independence to respond to the civil rights and black power movements of the time in the lyrical content and musical feel of their music. In the early 1960s, Aretha Franklin signed to Columbia, but they did not know how to use her voice at the time. You know what that means. At the end of her contract, however, she moved to Atlantic and she scored her first top 10 single, I Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You, backed by Muscle Shoals famed studio band. By the late 1960s, Aretha's more authentically black sound became more popular with black audiences and shifting feelings around black pride, power, and authenticity. And this bolstered her career. Now, traditionally, an artist like Nina Simone most closely favors the historical lineage of the Blues Mothers and the black femme recording artist beginnings. Having had success recording a song from Porgy and Bess in 1959, she signed to Colpix Records, and they relinquished all creative control to her, including the choice of material that would be recorded, and this was just in exchange for signing with them. Her fierce creative independence, political intonations, blueswoman sensibility, this did not align with the popularity of the respectable black people at the time. She was not a mainstream hit, but she did enjoy consistent listenership in more progressive circles like Greenwich Village. In 1964, after switching distributors, Simone became more independent and even more outspoken about the politics of the time. She released songs like Brown Baby, a tender Black Pride anthem, Mississippi Goddamn about the murder of Medgar Evers, and Old Jim Crow, an urgent anti-gradualist song, as well as For Women, a critique of the colorism, texturism, and archetypes that Black women face. That should have been a hit, if you ask me. She explained later in her autobiography that the purpose of that song was to inspire Black women to define beauty and identity for themselves without the influence of societal impositions. Contemporaneously, she was recording songs like I Put a Spell on You, Don't Let Me Be Misunderstood, as well as covers of Feeling Good and Sinner Man. Indeed, her embrace of both sensual, political, critical, and ecstatic likens her practice and praxis to the blues women at the beginning of the Black femme recording tradition. Simone went on to continue recording both standards as well as outspoken political songs, but became frustrated by the lack of support and what she perceived as the industry boycotting her records. In an age where respectability was being explicitly pursued as a civil rights tactic as well as a marketing ploy, could Nina Simone or Nina Simone-like figures succeed? Back then, is what I mean. Not now, of course. After the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968, the country became even more divided. Harder delineations occurred between the genres. Many Black musicians became more lyrically or sonically experimental, and the pop charts kind of preferred a specific sort of Black femme performance. It was mostly songs about love. Alternatively, men had a lot more autonomy in the sort of material that they were releasing. You had songs like War by Edwin Starr, and these are all songs that charted. War by Edwin Starr, Come and Get Your Love by Redbone, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud by James Brown, Everyday People by Sly and Family Stone. These all rated on the charts. The industry did not tolerate this sort of expression from women, and perhaps the highest charting pseudo-political song by a woman of the time was Carole King's I Feel the Earth Move, a song that vaguely references the overlap of desirability and politics. We're gonna fast forward through several decades. So, in the 1970s, artists like Shaka Khan made impact with jazz stylings. You had people like Sylvester making a huge impact in disco and dance music. You have people like Roberta Flack, singer, songwriter, in a way that other femme artists were not. You had Donna Summer and Gloria Gaynor defining disco's sound, and you had Aretha Franklin still experiencing great success. During this time, politically, the U.S. the U.S. Black middle class population grew, and the divide between Black rich and poor was widening. The Black suburban population doubled between 1970 and 1986, and the number of Blacks attending college increased 500% between 1960 and 1977. Simultaneously, the Reagan administration's anti-Black policies furthered socioeconomic and political oppression. The war on drugs from Reagan's presidency marked the start of mass incarceration rates that disproportionately sought to jail thousands of Black Americans under low-level crimes with severe punishments. And in the aftermath of waning political consciousness in popular Black music forms, a new art form known as hip-hop begins to emerge. The 1980s saw the emergence of cassette tapes, a reinvigoration of pop music. You had the categorization or kind of a splintering of R&B music into quiet storm and pop. You had a growth of regional trends such as go-go, Miami club, New York, Chicago house, Detroit techno, New Jack Swing, new synths, you had new drum machines, and while there was an ongoing political commentary in hip-hop, it wasn't until 1988 that a woman, MC Lyte, released her own solo album. And Lyte had socially conscious hits as well as charitable profit ventures, but at the same time, you also had a hyper-masculinized form of hip-hop emerging with NWA. The same year as Lyte's release, Tracy Chapman released her self-titled debut, and this was substantial. This is a dark-skinned black woman singing about poverty, fast car, it's a hit, and revolution, talking about a revolution, and she had massive commercial success. And even though her sophomore and third albums were not as high selling, they all went platinum. Now, I want to be clear that these women are exceptions to the predominant black femme musical successes of the time. Chapman's mellow, jazzy style could elegantly vie in adult, contemporary, and quiet storm formats, while its folk sensibility appealed to white audiences. But for the most part, throughout the 80s and into the 90s, successful black femmes performed restrained romantic archetypes. Whitney Houston, Janet Jackson, and Mariah Carey, to name a few. There was an emphasis on vocal prowess, melisma, vocal runs, and gospel-inspired but pop-passable skills. In hip-hop, the more successful women artists of the 1990s, while in control of their sexuality, performed mostly just around that theme and offered uncomplicated and few political commentaries. There were many girl groups as well as boy groups, and they favored the doo-wop groups of the 1950s with tight harmonies and romantic lyricism. This is also an era of some really, really ugly erasure, specifically in dance music. And you all know the songs Good Vibrations. Yeah. Everybody Dance Now. Gonna Make You Sweat, and Everybody, Everybody. All of those songs featured black women who were hired as session vocalists or background vocalists and then replaced and not credited. And so if you watch any of those videos, you will see people lip syncing to their songs. The 90s saw a hip-hopization of R&B as well as a popification of R&B. And this brings us right up to the beginning of the last tremendous, and what I would say is the contemporary moment of technologically informed extraction. But before that, there were amazing releases, conscious releases, by people like Lauryn Hill and India Arie. Lauryn Hill released her solo album in 1998 and won many Grammys. India Arie followed that 4 years later. She was nominated for 7 Grammys, 5 of which were in competition with Alicia Keys, who took all of those home. So, where are we now? Welcome to the era of the MP3 and streaming. In 1999, we saw the introduction of Napster, and this caused total mayday in the recording industry. They did not know what to do. As you may know, there were a couple of groups that sued Napster, but it took a while to shut down illegal downloading. And I would say that around the millennium, because of this popification of R&B and bluesification of pop, you had this crossover moment, right? You had black artists with crossover appeal becoming more popular. And you also had white artists with crossover appeal becoming more popular. People like Christina Aguilera, Amy Winehouse, Robin Thicke, Justin Timberlake, Joss Stone, to name a few. And there were not only stylistic implications to this, but phenotypic ones as well. What has changed? It would be somewhat remiss to say that it's difficult now to find fuller-bodied, political, darker-skinned femme artists. What I can say is that the success of darker-skinned, politically intoned artists has certainly diminished. Where Black women and darker women especially are able to experience industry support and eventual success, there seems to be an emphasis on these women procuring face and phenotype altering plastic surgery, specifically rhinoplasty, having near perfect bodies that are at once slim, curvaceous, and athletic, if not surged to fit a Coke bottle ideal. There's a good deal of white performers who are popular for performing soul, R&B, soulful pop music, artists like Adele, Snow Allegra. Also, people like Billie Eilish and Miley Cyrus come to mind for having depended on Black stylization either in music or physical appearance to establish commercial success for their careers. Political commentary in music is somewhat limited given the sheer number of artists and breadth of available music, and only in certain contexts of superstardom long into their careers and with well-established fan bases were artists like Beyonce and Solange able to release more politically toned, commercially successful music. It is plainly evident that fairer-skinned Black femme artists have an easier time establishing their careers with major as well as independent labels in a way that was not so starkly evident before the late 90s. Normani still has not released her debut album. It's nearly impossible to take a look at a comprehensive look at the music industry today, what with the means of production and distribution being so democratized, but there should be no doubt, and I would urge you to take a look at your listening habits if there is, that colorism in music has intensified in the new millennium, as well as the proliferation of non-Black artists performing music from the Black traditions. The third and current wave of the bias and hyper-extraction of Black femme cultural expression, as well as the negation of the political voice of the blues tradition, is happening in your phones today. There's many political and cultural reasons why. One could say the election of Barack Obama, the idealization of mixed race people, but there's also a deeply anti-Black convenience here, whereby one might categorically profess to liking Black people, they also might still dislike Blackness. But there is a significant evidence also that the rise in streaming, its particular algorithms for determining success, as well as the predominant modalities of online music marketing, have exacerbated the colorism, depoliticization, under-acknowledgement, and underpayment of Black femmes. So I want to look specifically at Spotify for this case study. Spotify being the most popular of the music streaming platforms. None of these streaming platforms pay artists. And that is the first of the aspects of the intensification of extraction enabled by technology. I also want to talk specifically about the Spotify algorithm, or BART, which stands for Bandits for Recommendations as Treatments. Now, here are several aspects of how that algorithm works, one of which is native language analysis. I'm going to describe that now. So native language analysis means, like, if I'm listening to a song, right, there's AI, and that can detect what language the song is in, right? Am I listening to a Spanish language song? Am I listening to an English language song? And it has been shown via Alexa and many other AI voice respondent technology that users of African American vernacular English are frequently misunderstood and misinterpreted. Therefore, I would suggest that this puts certain musicians who perform music in certain vernaculars at a disadvantage. There's also raw audio analyzation, raw audio analyzation means that an AI can detect basically, like, is this an upbeat song? Is it sad? Is it minor tonalities? What have you? There's probably some racist shit in there too, but I don't have a strong hypothesis at this time. Get back to me next week. Then there's this aspect called collaborative filtering. And this is probably a lot of racism probably happening here. So current listening to future listening, right? This is how Spotify ensures that you are continually entertained and that you are continuing to listen to their streaming platform. And it takes data from locality, proximity, and networks. So if any of you have anti-Black listening tendencies in this room, they will be encoded into all of our algorithms. That's why I asked up front. There's also playlist editions. Playlist editions are really impactful, obviously. Pre-saves, first day plays, and playlists are like these boosts to an artist's algorithm. And there's some concerns here, obviously, right? There are some artists that have better access to media. They have more supportive PR networks. They might be signed to larger labels that have PR wings. And we know about labels, don't we? There's also the platform crossover algorithm boost, which I, in my research, found to be quite disturbing. The platform crossover algorithm boost. Now, how many of you know my work on Instagram? Okay, so I've been talking about how Instagram is racist as hell. Well, Spotify gives music an algorithmic boost for bringing people over from a different platform. That is to say, if you click on a song from a reshare on Instagram, you get points, let's say, right? A boost, more popularity on Spotify. So the colorism, racism, bodyism that is present on Instagram just slides right on over into Spotify. So that's so convenient. There's other aspects as well. So here you can see, this is the screen that artists, when they're uploading their songs to Spotify, are presented with, and they have all these like options to help listeners identify, and also the AI and playlist makers identify what sort of music it is. Now take a look at these cultures, right? You can choose up to 2. That's very intersectional. African, Arabic, Asian, Buddhist, Caribbean, Celtic, Christian, Hindu, Indigenous, Islamic, Judaic, Latin, Sikh, South Asian. What's missing? Black music. So how are Black artists to create a space of cultural autonomy and recognition around the roots of their work if there's no identifier for them? Now, one could say that this prevents Black artists from being ghettoized, but one could also say that this allows many white artists to perform Black music. So let's come back to that question I asked at the beginning, huh? How are you listening to music? Is it at all anti-Black? Let out a groan. We'll be back right after this commercial break.
should be trying to completely overrule. It seems to me we cannot fall into the same trap when it comes to fatphobia, when it comes to Eurocentric beauty standards, when it comes to heightism. Why do you have to be 6 feet to be seen as beautiful or represented? Anyways, we have to have very high standards in terms of how we show up for Black women.
That's the end of the commercial break. So,
Oh, sorry.
Who's ready for some music? Tonight's musical guest hails from none other than New York City. Uptown. Uptown! She is known both for incisive criticism, a heartwarming smile, and public service. She once spoke these words at a Los Angeles performance on November 4th, 2021 at 8:33. Growing up in the 1990s in New York City, dance music, house-inspired house-inspired dance music to be specific, was not just a predominant genre, but a sonic texture of the city. Beyond that, my family roots in Chicago gave me multiple touch points to deepen access to house music's roots, listening to Chicago radio, whether house music on V103 or even smooth jazz on 95.5. This sensibility permeated this musical tradition, touched multiple styles of music within that landscape. I was disheartened to come into adulthood in Los Angeles, only to find that house music and underground dance floors did not resemble the Black family members for whom I'd grown up understanding that house music was a local culture and way of life. Deeply pained by this divestment, tonight's musical guest did not imagine that musical work would be a part of her practice, seeing an industry whereby she would be all but disqualified according to her skin tone, body type, unwillingness to undergo major phenotype altering and body type altering surgery. Tonight's musical guest comes from a rich musical study background. She studied piano beginning at the tender age of 4 at the Mannes School, founded by David Mannes, a European-American violinist in 1911, to enable, for the first time in the history of the nation, the opportunity for talented Black youngsters to obtain excellent musical training at nominal fees. The school is now part of the New School. After this, she studied with Miranda Hentoff, musician and daughter of Nat Hentoff, the famed journalist, jazz critic, and civil libertarian. And after being rejected from Juilliard, in the fashion of the great Nina Simone, she studied jazz piano closely with world-renowned multi-instrumentalist, composer, orchestrator, and educator Makonda Ken McIntyre until his untimely and tragic passing in 2001. She would go on to perform and write contemporary music throughout secondary and collegiate education, performing as a soloist, arranging music, and for 2 years, serving as the music director of the Harvard Fallen Angels, an a cappella group. Make some noise. During her tenure as music director, the Angels ascended to Harvard's most prestigious stage, the Sanders Theater, becoming the only contemporary women's vocal ensemble represented among the Sanders 7 turned Sanders 8. Tonight's musical guest aims to reclaim rave reparations for her community as well as herself in the form of praxis venture by that namesake, as well as in the form of a musical practice which centers house-inspired electronic sound landscapes, boisterous and soulful vocals, critical as well as ecstatic lyrical sensibilities, and political urgency in both content and form. Performing her take on the spiritual, Don't Get Weary, and her 2020 single, Evolution. Please put your hands together for Mandy Harris Williams. Can we play this thing? Is that possible? Learning to be better, stronger, smarter, and more caring of each other, almost in the way that man has made artificial intelligence a reminder here too that we can create intelligence. That the thoughts and actions that lead to a better world, they might be harder now, but with repetition and embedding and consistent emphasis, that honesty becomes easier, that apology becomes easier, that reparation becomes easier, that attraction and non-attraction to the people and spaces and narratives and practices and energies that align with our values rather than the next outgrowth of marketing, of Western philosophy and aesthetics. These synapses can become easier with effort. They will become easier with effort, like a literacy, like a reading, like a listening, like a knowing. And the knowing itself and the doing itself, they don't make life easier. better together, and they make us together. And if we want to talk together about what evolution really means for this particular humanity and this particular globe, it would seem the time is now. You say you wanna do better whenever we're together. You know it's what I wanna hear. I can't avoid that fakeness, it really will not change this. It's standing out to me so clear. It's time to move. Evolution. It's time to move. It's time to move. Evolution. It's time to move. Evolution. It's feeling like I can taste it. I really want to live it. Feel the freedom of no fear. So many people in cages, just like earning wages. It's standing out to me so clear. It's time to move. Giving everything evolution. It's time to move. Evolution. It's time to move. It's time to move. Evolution. Members don't get weary. We're gonna change our listening status, right? Members don't get weary. Members don't get weary. Just remember that. Just remember that, baby. Members don't get weary. Just remember that. Just remember that, baby. Members don't get weary. Just remember
Just remember that day. Just remember that day. Just remember that day. Just remember that day. Nothing but broken rearrange. Just remember that. So just remember that. Memories don't get me rich. Just remember that, baby. Just remember that, baby. Just
Where the black girls at? Nomadic girls at? Puerto Rican girls at? Dominicana girls at? Brazilian girls at? Mexicana girls at? Argentinian girls at? Chilean girls at? Salvadorian girls at? Iranian girls at? Canadian girls at? Afghani girls at? Malaysian girls at? Chinese girls at? Japanese girls at? Korean girls at? Mongolian girls at? Australian girls at? Filipino girls at? Moroccan girls at? Egyptian girls at? Eritrean girls at? Chinese girls at? Ethiopian girls at? Romani girls at? Australian girls at? What they about the business at? What they about the money at? What they about the honeys at? What they about the jewelry at?